Good evening, everybody. My name is Nancy Easterling. It is my honor to be the Executive Director of Historic Solderly. And you are in for a treat right now tonight with the third installment of this year's virtual speaker series. We are so glad you are joining us from all over. The one nice thing about going virtual, as we say every time, is you can join us from anywhere. So please do sign into the chat. Let us know where you're joining us from. I already see somebody from Detroit, Michigan. I am so excited, from Charlottesville, from all over. And we're glad that you're here tonight. This speaker series has been going on, as I said, this is a 14th season, and we are honored. We don't have many repeats, but this person was so popular the first time that we just had to bring her back again. And if you missed her the first time, you are in for such a treat. Let me do a quick introduction so that you know just what a treat you're in for tonight when we welcome Miss Abbott Kahler. She is a New York Times best-selling author as Karen Abbott of Sin in the Second City, American Rose, and tonight's book, Liar, Temptress, Soldier, Spy, named one of the best books of the year by the Library Journal, the Christian Science Monitor, and Amazon. She has written for TheNewYorker.com, The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, Smithsonian Magazine, and other publications, and has appeared on the History Channel, CBS Sunday Mornings, AMC's Making of the Mob, the Travel Channel's Monumental Mysteries, and the Discovery Channel. Her new book was Ghosts of Eden Park. That's, if you missed her before, I'm sorry we don't have it virtually. If you just missed it, you missed it. But it was an instant New York Times bestseller, an Edgar Award finalist for the best fact crime, and the Indie Next Pick, an Amazon bestseller book of 2019, and a Smithsonian Magazine top 10 history book of 2019. The Wall Street Journal calls Abbott one of the masters of the art of narrative nonfiction. It is such an honor. I'm so thrilled you were able to come back. And this book has been one that we were dying to get you to present to us. I'm telling everybody now, and I'll remind you at the end, I'm sure you are all going to want to read this book as soon as she's done. You can buy it off of our website, and she promises to do a signed book plate for everybody that buys it off of our website. So with no further ado, Abbott, we are so thrilled to have you back. I'm going to turn the floor over, and let's get started.
Great. Thank you so much, Nancy, for that lovely introduction. Thank you, Solderly, for having me back. You guys are always so much fun. Every time I go there, I try a new great cocktail that I bring home and have later on. Thank you, everybody, for joining me across the country. I hope you enjoy it tonight. And without further ado, I'm going to start my slideshow and my talk. I'm happy to, if you have questions during my presentation, throw them in the chat. If I get a chance, I'll answer them during the chat. If not, we will discuss it afterward. So I usually start my talks about, telling people how I got into this book, how I decided to write about female Civil War spies. And it's sort of a personal story. I was born and raised in Philadelphia, and I moved to Atlanta in the early 2000s, where I lived for 6 years. And it was quite a culture shock, as you can imagine, going from Philadelphia to Atlanta. And I noticed, there were Confederate flags on the lawn. There were jokes about the War of Northern Aggression. And it became apparent very quickly that the Civil War seeped into daily life and conversation in the South in a way it never does up north. And this point was really driven home for me one day when I was stuck in traffic on Route 400, which is Atlanta's main thoroughfare. I'm sure if anybody there is from Atlanta or has traveled to Atlanta, you know the hell that you are on when you are stuck on Route 400. I was stuck behind a pickup truck with a bumper sticker that read, "Don't blame me, I voted for Jeff Davis." Which I thought was quite a bizarre bumper sticker, and really sort of encapsulated all of the information and sort of feeling I had been getting about the Civil War being still very alive down south. And so I was stuck behind this pickup truck for a couple hours, and it really started me thinking about the Civil War and what stories might not have been told. And when I think about history, my mind always goes to, what were the women doing? And not just any women, what were the bad women doing? What were the defiant women doing? What were the revolutionary women doing? And I began looking into it. And of course, some women did things like knit socks, or they held bazaars to raise money for supplies for the Northern and Southern troops. And some women went a little bit further than that. They became informal recruiting officers, and they would shame any man who shirked his duty to enlist and fight. Here is one of my favorite cartoons that actually makes fun of this phenomenon. A woman is standing with her fiance and basically telling him, you have to wear my skirt or volunteer. Women were always sending crinolines over to their boyfriends saying, wear the skirt or volunteer. And of course, it shamed them suitably, and many of them enlisted because they had been shamed by their women. But I wanted to find women who went even further than that in their devotion to the cause. I wanted to find women who lied, seduced, wheedled, plundered, spied, drank, avenged, stole, and murdered their way through the war. And I think I found 4 women who did just that. And I can talk about this later on in questions, in question and answer section. But I really wanted to find 4 women, 2 for the North, 2 for the South, who came from different backgrounds, but whose stories were all connected in some way. And I wanted to weave a tapestry and tell the story of the Civil War through their eyes, tell it, in a way that it hadn't been done before. And so I really hope that if you read this book, you'll think that I accomplished that goal. And without further ado, I'll introduce some of my lady spies. This is Belle Boyd. She was 17 years old. She's a Confederate spy living in the Shenandoah Valley, Virginia. She was all id. Belle had absolutely no filter, not even for herself. She was sort of comic relief for me in this book. One of my favorite artifacts I found during my research was a letter that she wrote to her cousin right before the start of the war, in which she lobbies him to find her a husband. And I'm going to read a brief excerpt of that because it makes me laugh. I am tall, she wrote. I weigh 106.5 pounds. My form is beautiful. My eyes are of a dark blue and so expressive. My hair of a rich brown, and I think I tie it up nicely. My neck and arms are beautiful, and my foot is perfect. Only wear size 2.5 shoes. My teeth are the same pearly whiteness, I think perhaps a little whiter. Nose is quite as large as ever, neither Grecian nor Roman, but beautifully shaped, and indeed, I am decidedly the most beautiful of all of your cousins. So clearly, Belle had no problem with self-esteem. And she kicks things off in July of 1861. The Union Army was marching up the Shenandoah Valley, and they came to her hometown of Martinsburg. And they were going house to house, sort of, invading each home, taking things that they wanted to take, terrorizing all the citizens. Many of the citizens had fled, but Belle and her mother decided to stay and stand their ground in her home. And the Union Army knocked upon the door. Belle answered it. They threatened to raise a Union flag over Belle's home. And what did Belle do? Being the cool, calm, and collected person that she was, Belle shot a Union soldier dead. She shot him dead, and she got away with it. And she was very emboldened by the fact that she got away with it. And she decided that the South could not possibly win the war without her efforts. And using the connections she had through family members and family friends, many of whom were already enlisted in the Confederate Army and fighting, she decided to get a job with the Confederate position as a courier and a wannabe spy. She was sort of an aspiring spy. She took herself very seriously in this role. Here's a picture of Belle in her Confederate garb, taking herself very seriously. And Belle decided that she was going to use her feminine charm to become a notorious seductress. She seduced men from the North and South alike, Unions, rebels. And one of her reported paramours, and this is why I love nonfiction. These are the things that you cannot make up. One of her reported paramours was a man by the name of Major Dick Long. And I always feel like a 13-year-old boy recounting that story, but I found that newspaper clipping and just thought it was funny and had to include it. One Union journalist reported that Belle was, quote, closeted for 4 hours with a Union General, James Shields, and it was a very scandalous incident. She was very overt with both her opinions and her sexuality, which was very rare for a woman during this time period. And men loved her, of course, but women did not. And Belle acquired many nicknames, and the one that seemed to stick with her was the fastest girl in Virginia, or anywhere else for that matter. So this is Private Frank Thompson. Private Frank Thompson comes into the story with a bit of a secret. Frank Thompson was actually a woman named Emma Edmonds, and who had been living as a man for 2 years. So Frank Thompson, who ends up enlisting with the Union Army in Michigan, had quite an interesting background. She had a difficult childhood. She grew up in Canada. Her father was very strict. She had older sisters, and her father married them off one by one to neighboring farmers. He had similar plans for Emma. He wanted her to marry young and to help on the farm. He had already picked out a neighboring man for Emma. He was much her senior. And she did not want that life for herself. Emma Edmonds was an adventurous sort. She really craved adventure. She did not want this prescribed life that her father had already planned out for her. And she decided that the only way she was going to escape from a man was to become a man herself. So she goes to enlist in Detroit, disguising herself as Frank Thompson. And you might ask, how did a woman pass the medical exam to get into the Union Army? Now, of course, at this time, they're desperate for people. They just had very cursory exams. They just had bodies to fill, quotas to fill. They needed to get the army built up very quickly. They really only cared if you had teeth to pull off a powder cartridge, hands and feet to march. And it's estimated that about 400 women for both North and South disguise themselves as men to enlist for either the Confederate or Union armies. And I wanted to know how they got away with that. It was one thing to pass the medical exam because it was very cursory. They just sort of shoved you through. But marching with men and living in very close quarters with men day in and day out for years, how do you possibly pull that off without getting discovered? And I came to the conclusion that the main reason these women were not discovered is because nobody had any idea what a woman looked like wearing pants. It was such an unfathomable sight. They were so used to seeing women's bodies pushed and pulled in these very elaborate shapes with corsets and crinolines that the sight of a woman wearing pants was just it wasn't something that anyone even considered, even if a woman wearing pants was standing right in front of them. So that's one of the main reasons. And Emma was a very brave person, in my opinion. Not only did she have to worry about being shot by Confederate bullets, she was a nurse, and she was also on the front lines delivering mail. She was quite often in the direct line of Confederate fire. She also had to worry about her sex being discovered. And I think for Emma, there were many repercussions that would have been incredibly traumatic for her. She could have been arrested. She would be maybe charged with prostitution. And by far the worst repercussion, she would possibly and most likely get kicked out of the Union Army, which I think for Emma would have been the worst fate of all. So she started really proving herself with the Army. She earned the respect of her comrades. And she fell in love with one of them. That's something she did not plan on. She fell in love with a rather dashing gentleman who was also enlisted in the 2nd Michigan by the name of Jerome Robbins. So here's Jerome Robbins. And one of the great pleasures of researching this book was coming across Jerome Robbins' diary at the University of Michigan. And it was filled with all these entrees alluding to Emma, aka Frank Thompson. Of course, that's the name that Jerome Robbins knew Emma by, Frank Thompson. And he had these diary entries that would say things like, there's something peculiar about my friend Frank Thompson. A mystery seems to be connected with him. I'm not quite sure what it is, but he's definitely hiding something. So this was their romance, and Emma's sort of growing affection for him is one of the storylines I really enjoyed threading throughout the book. And she has to make a decision. Does she keep her feelings to herself, or does she take a risk and tell Jerome exactly who and what she is and sort of let the chips fall where they may and see what happens? So this is a Confederate spy named Rose O'Neill Greenhow. She's pictured here with her daughter, little Rose. And so Rose Greenhow was in Washington, D.C. She was a Confederate spy living in the Union capital of Washington, D.C. She was sort of this grand dame of Washington society. She had been an advisor to President James Buchanan, many other high-ranking politicians. She was very well known. She was very influential, and her whole life had fallen apart in the onset of the Civil War. She was desperate to regain it. She had lost with the election of Lincoln. She lost all of her friends. She lost all of her power. She lost her status in society. And she really wanted to help the Confederate Army so that she could also regain her position in society. And early on in 1861, she was approached by a Confederate captain. He wanted her to run a Confederate spy ring in the Washington, D.C., which was, of course, quite a risky proposition because she was an ardent sympathizer in the Capitol. But she decided to take the job. It was very important for her to do this job well, and she was very eager to get started. And like Belle Boyd, Rose Greenhow was also a notorious seductress. One of her reported paramours and sources was this man. He was Senator Henry Wilson. He possibly her most important paramour, her most important source. He was from Massachusetts. He was an abolitionist Republican who served as Lincoln's chairman of the Committee on Military Affairs. He was also a future vice president. So you can imagine it was quite a coup for Rose to get Senator Henry Wilson in her bedroom and get information from him. And when I did research at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., which has a lot of Rose's papers, I found some love letters that are reportedly from Senator Henry Wilson to Rose Greenhow. One of them reads, "You know that I do love you. I am suffering this morning. In fact, I am sick physically and mentally and know nothing that would soothe me so much as an hour with you." So he ended up being a very prolific and valuable source for Rose Greenhow because he was crazy about her. This is a picture of Rose Greenhow's cipher that she was given when she accepted the job as a spy master. And she took it very seriously. She memorized all of these symbols. She practiced writing them every day. If anybody out there is familiar with ciphers, this is kind of similar to the one in Edgar Allan Poe's The Gold Bug. Mysterious looking symbols concealing different letters, numbers, and words. If you can see Lincoln down here, sort of at the middle left, his symbol is inverted, like kind of an inverted triangle bisected by a slash. Rose had two nicknames for Lincoln. One was Beanpole and the other was Satan. So it gives you an idea of what she thought about Abraham Lincoln. And if Rose did not have time to write a message using this cipher, if she really was pressed for time, she also memorized the Morse code. And she had quite an ingenious way of telegraphing messages using the Morse code. At a certain hour, if she could not leave her home, she would have her scouts stand outside of her home, which was on Lafayette Square in Washington, D.C., and she would raise and lower her blinds according to the dots and dashes of the Morse code. And if she were out on the street, she could achieve the very same effect by fluttering her fan according to the dots and dashes of the Morse code. So she was really quite crafty and innovative with her spy work. So one of Rose's big early accomplishments was her involvement with the first Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas, as they call it in the South, in July of 1861. And this is another favorite archival find. This sort of goes behind the story. I'll give some context for it. Rose had been gathering information about Union plans, and she had heard something and confirmed it. And she wanted to get the message to Confederate General Beauregard in advance of this battle that was going to happen at Bull Run. So she summoned over a courier, a 16-year-old named Betty Duvall. Rose sat her down in her chair in her home and said, "I'm going to," and she wrote up this note in the cipher. She wrapped it up in this piece of black silk, and she tied it up in Betty's hair. And she gave Betty very specific instructions and said, "You're going to pass over the bridge. You're going to deliver this message to Beauregard. And when you pass the Union troops, they're not going to say anything to you. They're just going to wave the pretty girl on, thinking she was heading to or from the market. And you'll be fine. And you'll get to Confederate Beauregard's headquarters, and you'll let down your hair, and you will deliver this dispatch to him with this information that confirms what he was already suspecting about Union troop movements at Bull Run." So Betty Duvall did exactly this. She delivered the note to Confederate General Beauregard. And so the Confederates were very well prepared at this first Battle of Bull Run. The Union was not expecting them to be so well prepared. The Union thought that the war was going to be over in 90 days. They thought that they would meet the Confederates at the first Battle of Bull Run. Well, at that point, it was just going to be the Battle of Bull Run, no second Battle of Bull Run yet. They would defeat them there. They would march on to Richmond, Virginia, and capture the Confederate capital, and the war would be finished. But the Union suffered a resounding and very, very bloody, disastrous defeat at the first Battle of Bull Run. In no small small part to Rose's efforts, and Confederate President Jefferson Davis acknowledged that after the battle. And it was a very big coup for her. And with this victory for the Confederates at the Battle of Bull Run, it was very clear that the war was going to drag on for much, much longer. This is kind of a funny picture I came across. This was not taken during the Civil War. If anybody is familiar with historical clothing, it's clear that these people are about from the 1890s, several decades later. And the scene at the first Battle of Bull Run became so legendary. At the first Battle of Bull Run, all of these Union supporters decided it would be a lovely idea to pack a picnic, take the whole family out, and just watch the war. Let's watch the Union beat the Confederates for this lovely afternoon. And of course, it turned into a disaster. They ended up fleeing. A lot of them ended up being drowned in Bull Run Creek. Many of them were captured by the Confederates. It was general scene of mayhem. It had not been a good idea to take the family out for a picnic to watch the war. So 30 years later, that scene is now being reenacted by these people in 1890, sitting out on the battlefield with a nice picnic. Of course, this day that they were picnicking, there was actually no battle happening, but it sort of became a legendary scene and something that people did for quite a few years after the war. This is my fourth spy. This is Elizabeth Van Lew. And she was the opposite of Rose Greenhow. She was a Union spy living in the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. And whereas everybody always talked about Rose Greenhow's beauty, she was always lauded for being so beautiful and graceful. One of Elizabeth's contemporaries made a very catty remark. They said, Elizabeth, quote, was never as pretty as her portrait showed. Kind of very catty. And she also had an interesting background. Elizabeth was from Virginia, but she was sent north when she was a young girl to Philadelphia, where she was taught by an abolitionist governess. And when she returned to Virginia and her father passed away, she used all of her very significant inheritance to buy slaves and free them. She's bought them expressly to free them. She also freed all of her own family slaves against her father's wishes. And she became known as an abolitionist. And it was a very dangerous, after the war broke out, for Elizabeth to have these opinions, and the fact that they were pretty well known in her neighborhood was something that was very difficult for her. People followed her, people stalked her, people peeped inside her windows. And she knew that, at any moment she might be attacked for her views, or called a traitor, or hung up executed for her views. But nevertheless, she was very ballsy, very brave woman, and she decided to begin and operate a Union espionage ring in the Confederate capital of Virginia. She began recruiting people from all walks of life, including her brother. This is her brother, John Van Lew. Another great pleasure of researching this book was connecting with the great-grandson of one of his nieces, who spoke extensively with me about their spy ring. And he told me never before published information about how the spy ring operated. And it was quite ingenious. They had a really well-known hardware store, the family did. The Van Lew family owned and operated a very prominent store in Virginia. And John decided to take the paperwork from the store and use it in his espionage. So he would take blank invoices and purchase orders and sort of fill them out. But all of the quantities that he filled out, all the numbers correlated with certain coded references that he was going to send to the Union generals. For example, 370 iron hinges meant 3,700 cavalry, 30 anvils meant 30 batteries of artillery, and so on and so forth. So it was sort of coded information. And if it was passed over Confederate lines, the Confederates might look at it and just think it was just a normal business order, nothing amiss, nothing untoward that he was doing. So it was a very risky operation, though. And to make it even riskier, John Van Lew was married to an ardent Confederate sympathizer. And they all lived in the same home, in this big mansion in Richmond. Elizabeth Van Lew, her brother, and his Confederate wife. And his Confederate wife was so sort of vociferous in her views that she would not have hesitated to turn in both her husband and her sister-in-law if she suspected them of treasonous activity. This is Confederate President Jefferson Davis's wife, Varina Davis, who has quite an interesting role in this whole situation. Elizabeth Van Lew hatched a plan. She decided that she was going to take one of the family's former slaves, a woman named Mary Bowser, and sort of activate her as a spy. Now, Mary Bowser had been born enslaved into the Van Lew family. Elizabeth freed her when she was about 4 years old. And Elizabeth took a very special liking to Mary Bowser. I think she recognized that Mary Bowser was exceptionally intelligent and promising in terms of she was, somebody who Elizabeth thought had great promise. She sent her to be educated. She sent her to be a missionary in Liberia. She brought her back. She sent her north. And when she brought Mary Bowser back from the north, she was actually in violation of the law. It was not legal to educate enslaved people and then bring them back to the South, because it was not legal to teach them how to read or write at the time. And so Elizabeth approaches Mary and says, I have a proposition for you, and they discuss going to work for Varina Davis. So Mary agrees to this plan. Elizabeth pays a social call to Varina Davis, who is busy hiring staff for her, her home in Richmond. And Elizabeth says to her, I have a girl for you. She's not very bright and she stumbles in the kitchen, but she's loyal and she'll serve you well. And she sends over Mary Bowser. And of course, nobody has any idea that Mary Bowser is not only literate, but highly educated and gifted with a photographic memory. She's able to glance at a piece of paper and memorize what the paper says, look at maps and memorize the positions of Union troops. And she's able to eavesdrop on Jefferson Davis and the conversations he's having with his advisors and report it back to Elizabeth word for word. And she would become a very, very vital component of Elizabeth's spy ring, and somebody who I think was just invaluable in terms of Union intelligence and actually winning the war for the Union. So this guy probably needs no introduction. This is Stonewall Jackson. This is a Confederate general. He, of course, was a legendary Confederate general, especially known for his 1862 Valley campaign. And he was sort of a rock star of the Civil War. If the Civil War had a rock star general, it was Stonewall Jackson. One of my favorite stories is when he was in a Shenandoah Valley hotel. And of course, he's recognized, and all of the women go right across him and swarm him and begin pawing at him. They begin tearing the buttons from his coat. They begin trying to cut a lock of his hair. They're just basically all over him. And Stonewall Jackson takes a step back and says, ladies, this is the very first time I've been surrounded by the enemy, which I thought was a really great line. Probably needless to say, Belle Boyd, our 17-year-old Confederate spy, is obsessed with Stonewall Jackson. She told reporters that she wanted to, quote, occupy his tent and share his dangers, which if I were Stonewall Jackson would have terrified me more than anything the Union Army might have had in store. I wouldn't want to be in such close proximity to Belle Boyd. So a year later, and after a few adventures with Belle Boyd that I talk about in the book, Stonewall Jackson was shot during the Battle of Chancellorsville. His left arm and his shoulder were struck, and field surgeons decided to amputate his arm. They were about to toss it into a pile of limbs, but Jackson's chaplain saved the arm and gave it a proper Christian burial. One of his staff officers actually marked the area with a tombstone. And here it is, the arm of Stonewall Jackson, May 3rd, 1863. So you can actually visit Stonewall Jackson's arm. He died shortly thereafter. Stonewall himself died shortly thereafter. Belle, of course, was devastated by this news. She immediately sent a wire to the Virginia governor and said, please telegraph if General Jackson is dead. If so, save me a lock of his hair. So here is Union General George McClellan. As you can tell, he seems to think very highly of himself, which he actually did think very highly of himself in his Napoleonic stance there. And he was the rock star general of the North. He was a complete egomaniac. He boasted that he could bend a quarter between his thumb and forefinger and lift a 250-pound man over his head. He proclaimed that God himself had sent George McClellan to save the Union. And after the disaster at Bull Run, McClellan whipped the Army into shape, which is what Lincoln wanted him to do. And Lincoln hoped for a swift response to the defeat at Bull Run. But there was one problem with that. McClellan was incredibly cautious. He did not like to send his men into battle. Consequently, his men loved him because they were not being sent to die. Emma Edmonds, aka Private Frank Thompson, was one of McClellan's men. She also loved him. And he was so reluctant to go into battle that people often suspected him of having Southern loyalties. He clashed frequently with Abraham Lincoln. They had differing philosophies. He called Lincoln nothing more than a well-meaning baboon, and their relationship only grew more acrimonious as the war went on. So this is my favorite cartoons during the Civil War. It's called Crinoline and Quinine, and it's celebrating Southern women's abilities to smuggle things across the lines during the Civil War. And to give you a little context for this, I should mention the blockade. The blockade was a Union's main strategy, one of the Union's main strategies against the South, to block 3,500 miles of Confederate coastline. And it was so effective. It prevented not only the Southern soldiers from receiving medicine, food, clothing, supplies. It also prevented Southern people, just Southern citizens, from receiving things that they needed. And it was so effective and sophisticated that an equally effective and sophisticated smuggling arrangement sprung up in response. And it was mostly headed by Confederate women. And so this cartoon is celebrating those Confederate women and their smuggling abilities. And basically, the crinoline was instrumental in their smuggling capabilities. It's this rigid cage-like structure that at its apex could reach a diameter of 6 feet. And I'll read some of my favorite anecdotes about the crinoline. One woman managed to conceal inside her hoop skirt a roll of army cloth, several pairs of cavalry boots, a roll of crimson flannel, packages of gilt braid and sewing silk, cans of preserved meats, and a bag of coffee. That was the contraband tally for a single crossing. Belle Boyd, our Shenandoah spy, was sort of the queen of the inland blockade. One day, she stole from a Pennsylvania regiment. They awoke to discover that 200 sabers, 400 pistols, cavalry equipment for 200 men, and 1,400 muskets were missing, all because Southern women smuggled them down to Confederate soldiers. And to me, that's sort of a fascinating part of women's roles in the Civil War. You know, they were able to take society's constructs about womanhood and perceived weakness and exploit them. And they used their gender as both a physical and psychological disguise. You know, anytime officials accused these women of treason activity or smuggling or what have you, the standard response was, "How dare you suggest such a thing? Why would you ever suggest that I was capable of such behavior? I am a lady." And it was very effective. The men did not know how to respond to that. This is also a kind of an interesting smuggling artifact. This is a doll. Her name is Lucy Ann. Today, she lives in the Museum of the Confederacy, which is actually called the American Civil War Museum now in Richmond. But during the Civil War, she was very popular with Southern mothers. They hid quinine in her head. She had a paper mache head, and they were able to hide a good quantity of quinine in the heads. And of course, quinine was a medicine that was invaluable. It was used to combat malaria, which was a great affliction for both troops. And they would stuff the heads full of quinine and give these dolls to their daughters and tell their daughters to just cross the lines, you know, act normally. Of course, Union generals are not going to search these dolls for their paper mache heads. They're just going to wave hi to the cute little girls and let them cross. And it was also an interesting example of how women use their daughters in their war efforts. And Rose Greenhow was really a great example of this. She was always using her daughter, little Rose, in her espionage missions. And to me, it sort of exemplifies how these women, how desperate these women were to contribute to the war. They really truly believed that that they were safer with the Confederates in charge. Little Rose even would go to prison with Rose Greenhow, which I write about in the book. So this is one last story from the smuggling files. And I will tell the story as it was told to me. The curator at the American Civil War Museum said that one day a woman came in and she had this artifact. She called it, she was holding this artifact and said that her family lore said that her ancestor had been a Confederate spy, and that he used this little object often in his spying missions, and basically would write messages and roll them up in a little scroll and tuck them into this object and hide this object in the place least likely to be searched. You can imagine what the place least likely to be searched was. And the curator at the American Civil War Museum decided to name this object the anal acorn. That's the story behind that. I do not know how many spies actually use the anal acorn, but I thought it was a really interesting, sort of an interesting tangent of Civil War espionage. This is another bizarre cartoon that I came across about smuggling. And it goes back to the blockade that I mentioned earlier. By 1864, the blockade had dire consequences in the South. Southern businesses and public schools shut down because nobody could afford to pay teachers or provide the Confederate-approved textbooks. And to give you an example of the Confederate-approved textbooks, which are actually pretty funny, one of them posed this arithmetic question, quote, "If one Confederate soldier kills 90 Yankees, how many Yankees can 10 Confederate soldiers kill?" So prices kept rising, and by 1864, bacon was $20 a pound, which is about $302 in today's money, which is really, really expensive, obviously, and insane. So Southerners were understandably pretty angry about this. And here's a cartoon reflecting their anger. And it's made a cartoon depicting all of these gruesome items that they would like to be smuggling through the blockade. Up in the top left corner, there's a goblet made from a Yankee skull. Right next to that, there's a paperweight made of Yankee jawbones. There's jewelry made from Yankee teeth. And of course, most of these items were figments of the imagination. They were just sort of revenge objects. But there were reports about Southern women wearing brooches and other kinds of jewelry made from the bones of dead Yankee soldiers that were collected from battlefields. And that was happening, I think, in a couple Southern towns. So this is Alan Pinkerton, the famous Pinkerton detective with Abraham Lincoln. I've always been intrigued by the Pinkertons, and I was really delighted to learn that Alan Pinkerton played quite a big role in espionage during the Civil War. He was hired to do Secret Service work for the Union Army, and Pinkerton was horrible at counting Confederate troops. He kept corroborating McClellan's overinflated numbers of Confederate soldiers. He was no help in that regard. But what Pinkerton did very well was ferret out Confederate spies. And his first mission was to discover exactly how the Confederates got such great information that helped them win the Battle of Bull Run back in July of 1861. And he discovered that it was Rose O'Neal Greenhow who was the culprit behind this. So his first mission was to really track down Rose Greenhow, get evidence against her, and of course, stop her espionage work. So one of his very first missions, he sets out on a steamy August night. It's torrential downpour. He sets out with two of his men to go to Rose Greenhow's home in Lafayette Square in Washington, D.C. And there's a very humorous scene in the book where, he's standing on his men's shoulders. He's slipping around because it's so wet and raining. And he looks inside the window of Rose's parlor. And what does he see? He sees Rose Greenhow with a Union captain, apparently a traitorous Union captain, because the Union captain and Rose Greenhow are passionately kissing. And after they passionately kiss, the Union captain is showing Rose maps of various plans, battle plans and such. And they go on to have a very romantic and steamy evening together. And Pinkerton is furious about this. He declares Rose to be public enemy number one. And he files an official report about Rose Greenhow that says she has not used her almost irresistible seductive powers in vain among the officers of the army, not a few of whom she has robbed of patriotic hearts. And this was a very new problem. The idea of female traitors was something that nobody had considered. Women's loyalty was assumed. Women were the victims of war. Women were not the perpetrators of war. And so it was slowly dawning on Pinkerton and the other Union officials, that women were not only capable of treasonous activity, but they were capable of executing it more deftly than men. There was actually a great scene that I uncovered in an article and wrote about in the book where one of Lincoln's advisors asks this question, and you can almost hear the plaintive cry in his voice. He says, "What are we going to do with these fashionable female spies?" And it was a problem that they would have to grapple with throughout the war, eventually on both sides, North and South. So this is my final slide. This is one of my favorite tangential characters. His name was Benjamin Franklin Stringfellow. He was a spy for Confederate General Jeb Stuart. He had blonde hair, blue eyes. He weighed 94 pounds. And according to one of his comrades, he had a waist as wispy as a woman's. So he had a very unorthodox approach to his spying. He would discover when and where all of the Union balls were going to be held. He would put on his finest dress and call himself Sally Martin and go to these Union balls. And he would start dancing with all the Union soldiers. He would ask what the plans were, from Ulysses S. Grant. What was the next move? What was Grant thinking? What was the Union going to do next? And Sally Martin was a very popular woman to dance with at the balls. Everybody wanted to dance with Sally Martin. And of course, Benjamin Franklin Stringfellow would go back to General Jeb Stuart and report everything he had learned while being Sally Martin at these balls. And I like to include him to show, women weren't the only ones cross-dressing during the war. The men were in on that action too. So if anybody has any questions, that concludes the slideshow. I'd love to take questions and hear about any scandalous Civil War ancestors of anybody out there too.
Oh my gosh, that was great. Hey, as we mentioned right in the chat, we would love to be able to answer your questions. There were a couple of comments that Lenore Myers had put in tonight. Now, one of our local historians from Calvert did an answer, but I'd love to hear from you, Abbott, if there is something else that you know of that can add to this. It's the obvious question that women are going to be thinking about. How did you handle a menstruation if you are actually dressed up as a man, and how do you hide that for years? And even like, what do you do when men are peeing in the woods and you can't pee like that? Now, wonderful Michael Kent, who's one of our fabulous local historians, had given one answer that is, I knew this to be true, that people's diets were very different and very bad diets. And so stomach problems and blood in the stool was common. And people didn't pay as much attention to blood. But in all the documents that you read, was there anything else that you saw that made it added any other lights on that subject? Because all women, that's the first thing that came to our mind.
Yeah, absolutely. It was something that came to my mind too when I was researching, and he's absolutely right. The diet did play a factor, and poor diet could actually stop menstruation. They lost a significant amount of weight, and then when women go under a certain body fat percentage, they have amenorrhea, which is the stopping of the period. Also, the stress can induce amenorrhea. Just being under stress, you might not get your period. And if a woman did get her period, when the most common notion was that they would pass it off as a wound, an injury during the war. It was just, if there was bloody rags, they could just say that they had suffered some sort of wound, and they could just pass it off like that. And I'm sure that they all just sort of went off on their own to pee in the woods. I don't think anybody was paying much attention to what everybody else was doing in the woods. But that's basically it. I think the vast majority of them probably just stopped menstruating altogether.
I can completely see that, because I know stress can do that.
Yeah.
So Deborah asked, how many female spies were put to death? And I would add to that, how many female spies did you find and did you have to choose from? Because you did a lot of research to even choose the ones that you chose. But how many people did you hear of that were actually put to death?
Actually put to death, the only one I'm aware of is Mary Surratt, who of course was instrumental with tied into the gang that was involved with John Wilkes Booth in the assassination of Lincoln. I apologize in advance too. This book came out in 2014, so my research was about, I'm going on like 10 years ago for this research, but Mary Surratt is the only one that sticks out to me. And what was the second part of that? Oh, how many women spies? That's a very good question. There were quite a few. And I actually was very tempted to put a fifth spy in there. When Emma Edmonds leaves the book, which I won't discuss the circumstances of her departure from the story or the war, because I don't want to spoil it for anybody who wants to read. But there was a Union spy that I really was thinking about having take Emma's place. She was in the same city that Emma she sort of would enter the book in the same city that Emma left the book. And she would have taken the story all the way to the end of the war. But her story didn't really fit in with the other spies. And it was very important to me that they all were connected in some way, even if they didn't physically meet each other. Rose Greenhow was spying on Emma Edmonds in that Army of the Potomac. Rose Greenhow and Belle Boyd knew of each other. Belle Boyd idolized Rose Greenhow. A bunch of them were in Richmond at the same time. Belle Boyd was telling off General Benjamin Butler, Beast Butler. In the very next scene, Butler is recruiting Elizabeth to be a spy for the Union. So it was sort of, their stories all touched each other in certain ways. And I just decided to keep it simple with those 4 spies. And I wanted women who came from different backgrounds, different ages, different motivations, different personalities, who all sort of brought a different perspective to why they wanted to fight for their respective cause.
Very interesting. So David asked, did that first woman dressed as a Union soldier, which I think would have been Belle, correct?
Yeah,
who
Belle.
fell in love with an officer, ever reveal herself to him? Actually, no, that wouldn't be Belle. That would have been Emma.
Oh,
so
Emma.
Did
yeah.
in love with an officer ever reveal herself to him?
I don't want to spoil it. Yeah, I just, in case people want to see what happens with it, I'd rather not spoil it, but it's a good story.
It's a good story. Okay. So Karen asked, were female spies more prevalent in the Civil War compared with other wars? And if so, why? I don't know if any of your research would have had that comparative data.
Yeah.
But
I don't really, not having researched spies in other wars, really, I can't say. I do think we do know, of course, that there were spies in the Revolutionary War, but I doubt as many as the Civil War, just because, it's just my hunch that would have been the case. I think women were probably emboldened from one war to the next. There was quite a bit of time passed from the Revolutionary War to the Civil War, and I think women probably decided it was more possible during the mid 19th century than the previous. But I really don't know. I don't know the numbers on that.
Yeah, and I think it'd be interesting to even know how you could find out some of this, because not everything would have been recorded.
Yeah, and of course, with this World War II, you had European female spies, of course, Americans and Europeans alike fighting over in Europe. And this, of course, was just a homegrown American situation.
So Deborah asked, what happened to the young female slave? Because she was a fascinating character.
Oh, see, I don't want to, I don't want to spoil it again, but I will say that to me, it's a pity that she's not a household name, that Mary Bowser is not a household name. I do not think, I think that if without her bravery and without the information she provided to the Union, the war would have lasted much longer. There would have been a longer fight for the Union to win. But so I'll just leave it at that.
I think, anyone who steps outside of what people expect of them can do sometimes amazing things.
Absolutely.
Were any of these spies recognized or honored after the war?
Yes, I will say that. Yes, some of them were horribly mistreated after the war and did not get their due, and others really were sort of celebrated for their accomplishments. I thought in quite a touching way in terms of Emma Edmonds anyway. Yeah.
So how long did it take you, or how difficult was it to find this data? You were doing it 10 years ago, and now I know that there's much more data available. People are making documents available on the internet. I know you talked about even going in person to talk to people. How did you find most of your data? Because this is a side note that had to be harder to find the data on. How did you find most of it?
Well, I don't like to do research online because whatever's online has already been curated for you. Somebody has gone through it and decided what they think is interesting and relevant, but what they think is interesting and relevant might not be what I think is interesting and relevant. So whenever possible, you really want to try to go to the institution in person. And it's fun. It's the most fun part of writing a book. It's like being a detective on the hunt. You never know what's going to be in the next box or the next folder or the next envelope. Surprising connections are forged. Like funny quotes appear that you know would not have had access to if you were just doing your research online. So I think the good thing is people are digitizing more, which is good because it preserves the originals. You know, I went to the National Archive and went through Rose Greenhouse papers and was able to hold that piece of black silk in my hand at the National Archives, which was astounding. Yeah. And it's one of those magical moments where you have a visceral reaction. You know, you get chills thinking this person held this 150 years ago, and here I am holding it. I had the same experience at the New York Public Library. Where Elizabeth Van Leeuw has papers from her diary. And she is threatened throughout the book. She received one very menacing note from a group called the Whitecaps. And it was written in red, and it said, "Old lady, give us some of your blood to write with." And there was a skull and crossbones at the bottom. And just, I was scared reading it in the New York Public Library and in the safety of the library, you know, in 2011 or whatever it was. And I can't imagine how terrified Elizabeth was, you know, receiving that in 1863 and knowing that she could have been killed at any day.
So National Archives and the New York Public Library, any other places that you did a lot of your research?
Shenandoah Valley, I went to Belle Boyd has a house there. She has papers. I think that's where I got the funny note she wrote to her cousin, which I really love. Where else did I go? North Carolina for Rose Greenhow, University of Michigan for Jerome Robbins. It's all in the book. But I whenever, if there was any papers to be seen, I made sure I got there.
Amazing. So did you know what the final act of some of the female spies at the end of the war? So see, let me read that again, make sure I said that right. So Deborah asked, do you know what the final act of some of the female spies were at the end of the war?
The final act.
Sure, what she's asking. Was there a final something that each of them did that had a real big impact on
again, I would rather not spoil, but I will say that one of the reasons I was attracted to these four women is because I think they were all impactful in their own way. Belle Boyd, as much of sort of comic relief as she was, and not very serious, she did have one sort of glowing moment with Stonewall Jackson that I write about, that she was lauded for rightfully in her Confederate circles. You know, Rose Greenhow was very well respected, especially by the Confederacy, the Confederate president, who, in an unprecedented move, sent her as an ambassador to Europe to try to lobby Europe to recognize the Confederacy as its own separate country and government. And of course, Elizabeth Van Leeuw and Mary Bowser are really sort of appreciated at the end of the war, but not as much as they should have been, in my opinion. So
there, you know, of course, you know, Sodderly is down in Southern Maryland, and Maryland was a very interesting state. You know, it wanted to go south, and it was told to go north. So there were even the owners of Sodderly were Southern sympathizers. Son fought for the Confederacy. The enslaved that were there escaped to the side of the British, fought in the Battle of Petersburg in the same war against each other. So it was a very torn area in many ways. And Deborah had asked, did you happen to encounter any spies from Southern Maryland, or even from Maryland, I'd say?
Not off the top of my head. Once I focused on these four, I really sort of homed in on them because there was so much information. You know, the reason this book took so long to research and write was because I had to refamiliarize myself with all of the battles of the Civil War and the various players. And I only allowed myself to go on tangents when they were kind of really fascinating to me, and like as in the case of Benjamin Franklin Stringfellow. But no, not off the top of my head. That I found anybody in particular from Maryland, but I know it had a fascinating history. Yeah. It's a different area. In fact, you know, Sodderly's story and so many of the other stories. It is a lot of push me pull you going on in this area in particular. There was something else that had come up, and I think I
let me see if I can find it down there. When you were looking at and choosing everybody, it was about the fact that you did show a man who was dressed up as a woman. Were there any other stories of that you found when you were doing research? Because that was somebody who's willowy and wispy as a man.
He was quite pretty. He was a pretty man.
Yeah, he was pretty. So I bet you that was not necessarily uncommon. Did you hear of any other stories of that?
No, I'm sure there were other stories, but he was the most prominent I came across because he was very well regarded by General Jeb Stuart and was apparently very valuable. But I did come across a lot of information about how the women who were discovered to be the women who disguised themselves as men, how they were discovered to be women actually was quite interesting. The little giveaways. There was one general who threw an apple. And the woman who was dressed as a soldier instinctively lifted up a skirt. The skirt wasn't there. They were wearing pants, but they instinctively lifted their arms as though they were wearing a skirt and they were going to catch the apple. There was one soldier disguised as a man who gave birth while on picket duty. So the jig was up there. That was pretty funny. It's like, oops, I guess I'm outed. I just gave birth. Yeah. So I came across a lot of that kind of research, more so than stories of men disguising themselves as Southern belles. Yeah.
Well, there are a lot of people saying how much they're enjoying this. Karen said, I can't wait to read the book.
Oh, thank you. Happy to sign any book plates. And also, if you do book club, if you have a book club, I'm happy to talk to your book club. Just email me. Yeah. So
that's awesome. Well, Karen wants to know, where do you go from here and what is your next project?
Well, the book after this one was called The Ghost of Eden Park. It's the true story of America's most successful bootlegger, George Remus. If anybody ever watched Boardwalk Empire, he was a minor character in Boardwalk Empire. And the love story between him, the prohibition agent who put him in jail, and his scandalous wife, Imogene. I had a lot of fun with that book. Really incredibly entertaining. And my next book that I'm working on right now is called Then Came the Devil. It is the true story of a group of exiles who tried to build a utopia in Galapagos Islands in the 1930s. An attempt at utopia that went horribly awry, as utopians often do. And that will be published under my name, Abbott Kahler, Kahler. But I'm having a lot of fun with that. There is possibly the most scandalous character I've ever come across in history. And I've come across quite a few. So I'm having a lot of fun with that.
There is one request, and I don't know if you have the book there. I'm just going to ask, can you a short, fun passage, because they're just so in love with this book.
Oh,
you have a little passage you might.
Let me see if I can find one. It's rather thick.
It is rather thick. And
let me see.
I'm just saying to everybody right now, I don't know if Ginger still has any, because she ordered extra copies of The Ghost in Eden Park. You can check with our museum store manager. She might even still maybe have a copy that she bought, because she bought extras, and Abbott was kind enough to sign some of them. But
okay, let's see.
Somebody says this should be a movie.
Oh, thank you. Let's see. I'll read this brief excerpt about Stonewall Jackson, I guess. I don't know. Because I have it here.
Yeah.
Stonewall Jackson had just turned 38 years old and looked, some said, more scarecrow than human, with eerily bright blue eyes and a mangy brown mass of beard. His preferred uniform consisted of a threadbare, single-breasted coat left over from his service in the Mexican War, a battered kepi with a broken visor worn low to conceal his eyes, and an oversized pair of flop-top boots for his size 14 feet. His horse, Fancy, whom everyone else called Little Sorrel, stood only 15 hands high, and Jackson rode him with his feet drawn up so as to avoid dragging them on the ground. He spoke seldom and almost never laughed. On the rare occasions he did, he tossed back his head, let his mouth gape open, and made no sound whatsoever. Once an injured Northerner, captured by Jackson's men, asked to be lifted up to catch a glimpse of the general. He stared at Jackson for a moment and then, in a tone of disbelief and disgust, exclaimed, "Oh my God, lay me down." Jackson was as idiosyncratic as he was brilliant. His peculiar habits and tendency toward hypochondria became as legendary as his skill in the battlefield. He thought of himself as being, quote, out of balance, and even under fire would stop to raise one arm, waiting for the blood to rush down his body and establish equilibrium. He refused to eat pepper because it made his left leg weak. A partial deafness in one ear often made it difficult for him to detect distant artillery fire or to determine the direction from which it came. Convinced that every one of his organs was malfunctioning to some extent, he self-medicated with a variety of concoctions, inhaling glycerin and silver nitrate and ingesting a number of ammonia preparations. Despite his piety, he was utterly unfazed by the prospect of murder or death. He would have shot a man at the drop of a hat, one Confederate soldier declared, and he'd drop it himself. He ordered the firing squad execution of a soldier, a father of four, for assaulting a man of higher rank. The general prayed over the incident and found, as he always did, that God's will matched up with his own. During one battle, he inquired sharply about a missing courier and was told the young man had been killed. Very commendable, Jackson muttered soberly and put the matter out of his mind.
The comment, this was great, perfect passage. David had commented, love your deep personal writing style. Consider the traitor general from Southern Maryland, James Wilkinson, for future.
Wilkinson.
Okay.
Yes. Please email me that because I might forget. James Wilkinson. I'll have to look it up.
We will definitely do that. So this was absolutely wonderful. You know, I love how you bring to life different sides of the past that we don't necessarily think about. And
thank you.
Look at wars through definitely, the eyes of the men who were fighting at the time. But and to see that the impact that women can and did have on this war and many others just sheds a new light on it. And Ginger did say they sold all your books of The Ghost of Eden Park, which is not
wonderful.
But she is telling everybody she can order more. And she said she's sure that Abbott will sign a book plate for anybody who'd like to order that book. So if you want to contact our museum store, you contact us. You can order both books. And
I'm happy to do a book club for that too.
Absolutely.
That has its own slideshow. So.
Yeah. So thank you, Ginger, for letting us know. And Abbott, thank you for being willing to do that as well.
Of course. Thank you for having me tonight. I always love coming to Sotterly. I look forward to doing it again in person. So.
Yeah. And lots of people. Fascinating. Thank you. A lot of comments in there. This was wonderful. To all of our wonderful viewers tonight, I'm so glad you could join us for this next piece of our Sotterly speaker series. If you love what you're seeing at Sotterly, if you love the presentations we're putting on, consider joining us. Become a member. We'd love for you to help us continue all this great programming and bringing it to you free of charge. We love to bring this free, and we will continue doing so throughout this year. Abbott, you were fabulous. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
To all of our viewers, we hope you have a great evening, and we will see you at our next speaker series. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Good night.